It was late in the afternoon when I finally awoke, feeling both strengthened and refreshed. Sherlock Holmes remained seated just as I had left him, except he had set aside his violin and was engrossed in a book. He glanced over at me as I stirred, and I observed that his expression was dark and troubled. He remarked that I had slept soundly, expressing his concern that our earlier conversation might have disturbed me. I replied that I had heard nothing, and inquired if he had received any fresh news. He regrettably informed me that he had not. He admitted to being surprised and disappointed, as he had anticipated something conclusive by that time. Wiggins had just come to report, stating that no trace of the launch could be found. He considered it a frustrating setback, as every hour was critical. I offered to assist, declaring that I felt perfectly fresh and was ready for another night's outing. He declined, explaining that we could do nothing but wait. If we were to leave, the message might arrive while we were gone, causing further delays. He insisted that I could do as I wished, but he had to remain vigilant. With that, I decided to visit Camberwell and pay a call on Mrs. Cecil Forrester, as she had requested me to do the day before. Holmes, with a hint of amusement in his eyes, asked if I was referring to Mrs. Cecil Forrester. I clarified that I would also be seeing Miss Morstan, as they were both eager to hear about our development. Holmes cautioned me against sharing too much information, stating that women should never be entirely trusted, even the best of them. I chose not to argue with this rather atrocious sentiment, and informed him that I would return in an hour or two. He wished me good luck and suggested that if I was crossing the river, I might as well bring back Toby, as he doubted we would have any use for him now. I took our mongrel with me and left him, along with a half-sovereign, at the old naturalist's in Pinchin Lane. Upon reaching Camberwell, I found Miss Morstan a little weary from her nocturnal adventures, yet very eager for news. Mrs. Forrester was also filled with curiosity. I recounted everything we had done, carefully omitting the more horrifying details of the tragedy. Thus, while I mentioned Mr. Sholto's death, I refrained from discussing the specifics surrounding it. Despite my omissions, my account was enough to startle and amaze them. Mrs. Forrester exclaimed that it was a romance, featuring an injured lady, a treasure worth $500,000, a black cannibal, and a wooden-legged ruffian, all of which replaced the conventional dragon or wicked earl. Miss Morstan added, with a bright glance at me, that there were 2 knight-errants to the rescue. Mrs. Forrester then pointed out to Miss Morstan that her fortune depended on the outcome of the search, suggesting that she did not seem nearly excited enough. She encouraged her to imagine what it would be like to be so wealthy and to have the world at her feet. It filled me with a small thrill of joy to notice that she showed no signs of elation at the prospect. Instead, she tossed her proud head as if the matter were of little interest to her. She expressed her concern for Mr. Thaddeus Sholto, stating that nothing else mattered, and emphasized that he had behaved very kindly and honorably throughout the ordeal. She believed it was their duty to clear him of the dreadful and unfounded charge against him. By the time I left Camberwell, it was evening, and it was quite dark when I returned home. I found Holmes's book and pipe lying beside his chair, but he was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, hoping to find a note, but there was none. I mentioned to Mrs. Hudson as she came up to lower the blinds that I supposed Mr. Sherlock Holmes had gone out. She corrected me, informing me that he had gone to his room, and then lowered her voice into an impressive whisper to express her fear for his health. When I inquired why she felt that way, she explained that he was acting strangely. After I had left, he had walked back and forth until she grew weary of hearing him. She had heard him talking to himself and muttering, and every time the bell rang, he would come to the stairhead and ask her what it was. Now he had slammed the door to his room, but she could hear him still pacing. She expressed her hope that he would not become ill, mentioning that she had suggested cooling medicine to him, but he had reacted to her suggestion with such a look that she was unsure how she had managed to leave the room. I reassured Mrs. Hudson that she had no cause for concern, sharing that I had seen him like this before, and that he had some trivial matter on his mind, making him restless. I attempted to speak lightly to her, but I felt uneasy myself as I listened to the dull sound of his tread throughout the long night, knowing how his keen spirit was chafing against this involuntary inaction. At breakfast time he appeared worn and haggard, with a slight feverish flush on either cheek. I remarked that he was overworking himself, and noted that I had heard him marching about during the night. He replied that he could not sleep, explaining that the infernal problem was consuming him. He lamented that it was too much to be stymied by such a petty obstacle when all else had been overcome. Despite knowing the men, the launch, and everything related, he had received no news. He had set other agencies to work, and used every means at his disposal. The entire river had been searched on both sides, but still there was no news, and Mrs. Smith had not heard from her husband. He was close to concluding that they had scuttled the craft, although he acknowledged that there were objections to that theory. I suggested that perhaps Mrs. Smith had led us astray. He dismissed that idea, sharing that inquiries had been made, confirming the existence of a launch fitting that description. I questioned whether it could have gone up the river, and he affirmed that he had considered that possibility as well, informing me that a search party was working up to Richmond. He stated that if no news arrived that day, he would set off the next day to pursue the men rather than the boat, expressing his hope that we would hear something soon. However, we did not. Not a word came from Wiggins or any other agencies. Articles about the Norwood tragedy appeared in most papers, many of which seemed rather hostile toward the unfortunate Thaddeus Sholto. No new details emerged, save that an inquest was scheduled for the following day. I walked over to Camberwell in the evening to share our lack of success with the ladies, and upon my return I found Holmes dejected and somewhat morose. He hardly responded to my inquiries, and busied himself all evening with an intricate chemical analysis that involved much heating of retorts and distilling of vapors, culminating in a smell that drove me out of the apartment. Until the small hours of the morning, I could hear the clinking of his test tubes, indicating that he was still engrossed in his unpleasant experiment. In the early dawn, I awoke with a start to find him standing by my bedside, dressed in a rough sailor outfit, complete with a pea-jacket and a coarse red scarf around his neck. He announced that he was heading down the river, having turned the situation over in his mind, and concluded that there was only one viable course of action, which was worth a try. I asked if I could accompany him, but he insisted that I would be more useful if I remained behind as his representative. Though he was reluctant to leave, as it was possible some message might arrive during the day, he wanted me to open all notes and telegrams, and to act on my own judgment if any news came in. He sought my assurance that I could be relied upon, to which I affirmed my commitment. He warned me that I might not be able to wire him, as he could not yet predict where he might be. However, he expressed optimism that he would have some news before returning. By breakfast time, I had heard nothing from him. Upon opening the Standard, I discovered a fresh reference to the Casey. It remarked that the Upper Norwood tragedy promised to be even more complex and mysterious than initially believed. Fresh evidence had emerged indicating that Mr. Thaddeus Sholto could not have been involved, as he and the housekeeper, Mrs. Burnstone, had both been released the previous evening. It was suggested that the police had a lead concerning the real culprits, which was being pursued by Mr. Athelney Jones of Scotland Yard, known for his energy and sagacity. Further arrests were anticipated at any moment. I found this information somewhat reassuring, knowing that friend Sholto was safe. I wondered what the new clue might be, though it seemed to be a common pattern whenever the police had made an error. I tossed the paper onto the table, but at that moment an advertisement in the agony column caught my eye. It read as follows: Lost. Whereas Mordecai Smith, boatman, and his son, Jim, left Smith's Wharf at or about 3 o'clock last Tuesday morning in the steam launch Aurora, black with 2 red stripes, funnel black with a white band. The sum of £5 will be paid to anyone who can give information to Mrs. Smith at Smith's Wharf or at 228 Baker Street as to the whereabouts of the said murder. It was clear that this was Holmes's doing, as the Baker Street address proved. I found it rather clever, as it could be read by the fugitives without revealing the natural anxiety of a wife for her missing husband. The day dragged on. Each time a knock sounded at the door or a sharp step echoed in the street, I imagined it was either Holmes returning or an answer to his advertisement. I attempted to read, but my thoughts drifted to our strange pursuit and the mismatched, villainous duo we were after. I wondered if there could be some fundamental flaw in my companion's reasoning. Might he be suffering from a great self-deception? Was it not possible that his agile mind had constructed this wild theory on faulty premises? I had never known him to be wrong, yet even the keenest reasoner could occasionally be misled. I considered that he might fall into error due to the over-refinement of his logic, preferring a subtle, bizarre explanation when a simpler, more straightforward one was available. On the other hand, I had seen the evidence and heard the rationale behind his deductions. As I reflected on the lengthy chain of curious circumstances, many trivial in themselves, but all pointing in the same direction, I could not deny that even if Holmes's explanation were incorrect, the true theory must be equally outlandish and startling. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a loud peal at the bell heralded the arrival of an authoritative voice in the hall. To my surprise, Mr. Athelney Jones was shown in. He appeared quite different from the brusque and confident figure who had taken over the case at Upper Norwood. His expression was downcast, and his demeanor was meek and almost apologetic. He greeted me and acknowledged that he understood Mr. Sherlock Holmes was out. I informed him that I could not be certain when he would return, but invited him to wait, offering him a chair and a cigar. He accepted the cigar, mopping his face with a red bandana handkerchief, and agreed to a half-glass of whiskey and soda, explaining that the heat of the day had been troubling him. He began to recount his theory regarding the Norwood case, admitting that he had been forced to reconsider it. He detailed how he had tightened his net around Mr. Sholto, only to have him slip through with an unshakable alibi. He explained that from the moment Sholto left his brother's room, he was never out of sight of others, thus eliminating him as a suspect in the climbing over roofs and through trap-doors. He lamented that the case was very dark, and his professional reputation was at stake, leading him to seek assistance. I acknowledged that everyone needed help at times. He then praised Holmes, expressing his admiration for him as a wonderful man who could shed light on any case. He noted that while Holmes was irregular in his methods and perhaps too quick to jump to conclusions, he believed he would have made a promising officer, a sentiment he was unashamed to share. He presented me with a telegram he had received from Holmes that morning, noting it was dated from Poplar at 12 o'clock. The message instructed him to go to Baker Street at once, advising that if he had not returned, to wait for him, as he was close to tracking down the Sholto gang, and that I could join him that night if I wished to be part of the conclusion. I remarked that this sounded promising, indicating that Holmes had evidently picked up the trail again. Jones responded with evident satisfaction, declaring that even the best of them could occasionally be thrown off track. He recognized that this could be a false alarm, but as an officer of the law, he could not afford to let any chance slip away. Just then, there was a commotion at the door, and we heard a heavy step ascending the stairs, accompanied by a great wheezing and rattling, as if someone were struggling to breathe. The sound paused occasionally as if the climb were too much for the individual, but eventually he reached our door and entered. The man was aged and dressed in seafaring attire, with an old pea-jacket buttoned up to his throat. He appeared hunched, his knees shaky, and his breathing was clearly labored. Leaning on a thick oaken cudgel, he struggled to draw air into his lungs. He wore a colored scarf around his chin, and I could discern little of his face except for a pair of keen dark eyes, shaded by bushy white brows and long gray side whiskers. Overall, he gave the impression of a respectable master mariner who had fallen into age and poverty. I asked what he wanted, and he slowly looked around, characteristic of the methodical manner of old age. He inquired if Mr. Sherlock Holmes was present. I informed him that I was acting on Holmes's behalf, and that he could relay any message to me. He insisted that he needed to speak directly to Holmes, repeating his insistence. I reiterated that I was representing him, and asked if it was about Mordecai Smith's boat. But he confirmed that he knew exactly where it was, where the men were, and where the treasure was located, asserting his knowledge of it all. Despite my insistence, he remained obstinate, repeating that he would only share the information with Holmes himself. He attempted to shuffle towards the door, but Athelney Jones blocked his way, urging him to wait. Jones emphasized the importance of the information and insisted they would keep him there until Holmes returned. The old man made a feeble attempt to escape, but recognizing the futility of his resistance, he conceded. He complained about the treatment he was receiving, lamenting that he had come to see a gentleman only to be seized and treated in such a manner. I assured him that he would not be worse off and promised recompense for the loss of his time. I invited him to sit on the sofa, assuring him that he wouldn't have to wait long. Reluctantly, he crossed over to the sofa and sat down, resting his face on his hands. Jones and I resumed our cigars and conversation. Suddenly, Holmes's voice interrupted us. He pointed out that we might offer him a cigar, too. We both jumped in our chairs to find Holmes sitting beside us, observing with quiet amusement. I exclaimed in surprise, asking where the old man had gone. Holmes revealed that he was the old man, holding out a heap of white hair, including a wig, whiskers, and eyebrows. He remarked that he thought his disguise was quite good, but he had not expected it to withstand that test. Jones, delighted, praised him, suggesting he would have made a fine actor, complimenting his workhouse cough and weak legs, which were worth a small fortune. He admitted to having suspected Holmes's identity based on the glint in his eye. Holmes explained that he had been working in disguise all day, noting that many in the criminal world had begun to recognize him, especially since our friend had published some of his cases. Therefore, he could only pursue his investigations under simple disguises like this one. He confirmed that he had managed to send the wire that brought Jones here and then, inquired about the progress of Jones's case. Jones expressed his frustration, stating that it had all come to nothing, and he was forced to release 2 of his prisoners, with no evidence against the remaining 2. Holmes assured him not to worry, as they would provide 2 new suspects, but he insisted that Jones must follow his lead. Jones agreed, provided Holmes would help him apprehend the men. Holmes outlined his immediate needs, requesting a fast police launch to be at Westminster Stairs at 7 o'clock. Jones assured him that this could easily be arranged, as there was usually one available. He offered to step across the road to make sure. Holmes then asked for 2 strong men in case of resistance, to which Jones replied that there would be 2 or 3 in the boat. Holmes indicated that capturing the men would also lead to securing the treasure, and proposed that it would be a pleasure to take the box to the young lady to whom half of it rightfully belonged, suggesting she should be the first to open it. I expressed that it would indeed be a great pleasure for me. Jones considered it rather an irregular proceeding, but acknowledged that the entire situation was irregular, and that they must overlook that detail. He stipulated that the treasure would need to be handed over to the authorities until after the official investigation. Holmes agreed that this could be easily managed and requested one final point. He wished to have some details from Jonathan Small himself. He liked to work out the details of his cases, and as long as Small was efficiently guarded, he saw no objection to having an unofficial interview with him, either in his rooms or elsewhere. Jones concurred, albeit with the caveat that he had yet to confirm the existence of Jonathan Small. However, he could not refuse Holmes an interview if he managed to catch him. With that understood, Holmes insisted that Jones join him for dinner, which would be ready in half an hour. He mentioned oysters and a brace of grouse, along with something special in white wines, and I chimed in, noting that Holmes had yet to receive recognition for his merits as a housekeeper.